awesome, which is why I love chatting with you. 888-630-WMAL, 888-630-9625. And so right now I want to go to our guest, Nicholas Grossman. He's a professor of international relations at the University of Illinois, senior editor of Arc Digital, and author of Drones and Terrorism. Nicholas, it's so great to talk to you again.
Hi, thanks for having me, Stacy.
All right, so we've got a lot going on in Iran right now. Iran, Iraq, our troops, missiles, a downed plane, the president actually issuing a drone strike on a known terrorist and enemy combatant. And I'm just looking for your analysis here. Tell us what we don't know, maybe.
Well, the most recent thing that happened, which I would take as good news, is it looks like things are calming down, at least a little. So the last thing that happened was Iran fired missiles at two Iraqi bases where there are U.S. troops, and it ended up killing nobody, which might have also been on purpose, a signal that Iran was ready to back down in response to the United States killing Qasem Soleimani, one of their top generals.
So should Americans be concerned that they took to firing rockets and missiles immediately after they had their funeral, their 3 days of mourning? They actually did what they said they were going to do, which was took some retaliatory action against the United States. Should Americans be concerned about that happening again and again in the future?
I don't think from this thing specifically that the firing on U.S. base was in a way showing what they were capable of, that if they wanted to, they could fire a lot more missiles at a lot more locations, including some perhaps civilian locations like, say, embassies or consulates, or even try to perhaps kidnap U.S. citizens. Didn't do any of that, possible escalations. Instead, they did this shot at the two U.S. bases and didn't kill anybody. And so it almost seems to me like a way of saving face while also backing down. And so I don't think Americans need to be concerned about that immediately, but there still are the big concerns of the larger U.S.-Iran confrontation, which involves Iran's nuclear program and things like influence over Iraq and the Syrian civil war, in which the U.S. and Iran are both involved in, but on either side.
So let's talk some more about that, because I think, so first of all, we don't have the kind of reporting that we really need coming from the mainstream media. They don't do any in-depth reporting over there anymore. It's mainly, how does this help us bash President Trump? And if a story doesn't help them bash President Trump, then they don't bother reporting on it. So there's a lot of information, kind of fresh news out of the Middle East, that if you're not subscribing to one of the news sources that covers the Middle East exclusively, or if you're not really plugged into that area of online social media, you're not finding anything out about that as an American. Is there new news that we need to know, or new developments or shifts that would help us to understand what we're seeing right now?
So I think if you look at all of them, of the recent back and forth between U.S. and Iran, in context, that what you see is probably the best example of what President Trump calls his America First policy, that as a shift from previous U.S. policy, there were a couple of incidents where first, when Iran escalated, it was to attack some oil tankers in the Gulf, and there were some calls for the U.S. to act, and the president didn't do anything. And Iran shot down a U.S. drone, and he issued some threats but didn't order an attack. Then there were attacks on Saudi Arabia, and he helped support the Saudis, but did not order an attack despite some people calling for it. And then when an Iran-backed group called Kataib Hezbollah attacked a U.S. contractor, killed a U.S. contractor in Iraq, then the president struck back pretty hard, killed 25 of that Iraqi militia. And then when Iran then responded, in part directed by Qasem Soleimani, the U.S. accused of surrounding the embassy in these protests that turned violent and destroyed some parts of the embassy, then the president attacked, killed Soleimani, and also the leader of Kataib Hezbollah, his name is al-Mohandes. And so that action shows that whereas attacking U.S. partners, maybe previous presidents would have been more quick to act there, this president isn't. But then when Iran and Iran-backed groups attacked Americans, then responded very harshly. And it looks to me like that message has been pretty clearly communicated to Iran.
So I love that rundown. One of the things that the president mentioned earlier today in his address to the nation about Iran was that there were 2 drones that were struck down. Now, I remember the one. So where was the second one? Was it do we have it wrong when we thinking about the one drone? Because he mentioned 2 today.
Well, so the other person who had gotten attacked was the leader of Kataib Hezbollah, so was an Iraqi who led a militia that had been behind some attacks against U.S. troops or U.S. allied Iraqi groups in the country. And so the other strike against him is also a really big deal because while Iran is a big part of this, Iraq is maybe even a bigger part of it. And the Iraqi government, the United States, is in Iraq by permission from the Iraqi government as part of the coalition fighting ISIS. And Iraq started to maybe take some steps to revoke that permission. There was a vote in parliament, but it was 170 to nothing. But that's because Sunni Arab groups and Kurdish groups both boycotted it. But it still passed, and it indicated that Iraq might be potentially angry over these attacks on its soil, and especially over this militia leader that helped fight against ISIS.
So, and then there's also that they shot down one of our drones, and there was supposed to be one of those that we knew about, but earlier today he mentioned 2. Or am I wrong about him mentioning 2 drones that were shot down?
Oh, I'm not aware of that one. That I know there was the older drone incident, which that Iran had shot down a U.S. spy drone, but I'm not sure of one today.
Okay, so in the big scheme of things, it's been a very tumultuous few days. There's been a ton of really just, some of it's been easy enough to observe. We issued a drone strike. We killed Soleimani. We killed him because he's killed 600 of our soldiers, troops, and he's also maimed tens of thousands of others. He was a purveyor of terror attacks, and he was in the area planning more. We get that part. That's pretty easy to kind of, listen to and understand. But then there are dynamics going forward from there where Iran has to try to negotiate with the United States from a position, really, they're in a worse place because the Iran deal is actually about to expire. President Trump pulled the United States out of it beforehand anyway. So they've got to come to the table. What's their positioning now? Is it better than before? Are they in an equal footing to where they were with President Obama, or are they in a worse position than where they were as they're dealing with President Trump?
In a way, both Iran and the United States are in worse positions. So I don't know. It's hard to say, because conditions are worse for both. That who has a clear advantage here? Because during the nuclear deal, things were more stable, and Iran had more economic benefits and also had more restrictions on its nuclear program, but was still continuing to do things like sponsor terrorists that oppose U.S. interests. And the United States, after Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, has a lot less international support, which means there aren't, say, Europeans, not to mention China or Russia, who are willing to join in sanctions or join in U.S. pressure campaigns. So the U.S. is more on its own. Iran's economy is weaker because of the sanctions that the U.S. has imposed. But also, Iran is enjoying maybe more of a nationalist moment. They are having problems at home with, in part due to economic problems, having some protests. But recently, and you mentioned earlier the days of funeral processions, that this was a way for the government to kind of rally together the country behind a nationalist, anti-American sentiment. And that might make it harder for Iran to enter into negotiations with the U.S. So it's possible that the president might say, kind of like he tried with North Korea, of, I can try to, make a deal, at least if there's something in U.S. interest, we can talk about it. But from Iran's perspective, especially with the U.S. election coming up, they know that if they wait a year and Trump gets reelected, they can probably still make the same deal with him then. But if he doesn't get reelected, then they'll probably get a better deal from the Democrat. And so my guess is that they'll at least wait it out a year before agreeing to negotiations.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for that. We run over just a tad. Professor of International Relations at the University of Illinois. Thank you so much, Nicholas Grossman, for joining us today. And we'll talk to you again soon. We're going to go straight to traffic and weather. We have Ed Rodriguez in the Hadid Carpet Cleaning Traffic Center.
We're going to Centerville. Boy, it's so different.
Okay, I'll play my taped weather. We'll go into spots. We do this with Larry sometimes, and what we'll do is we'll move that 60 spot that we were going to go into to 429.
28th.
where it was open before. It now will have a 429. Okay.
Okay.
Westbound toll road, the eastbound Dulles connector on
Larry does this all the time, so we're
Yeah,
good.
I
Play.
forgot
Lucky
about
you.
not having
It's
the
okay.
20
He
off.
kept going.
The WMAL Weather Channel forecast.
Chilly temperature Thursday.